Adam Wingard's live-action Death Note adaptation has been available for streaming on Netflix for a while now, and the reviews were, well, let's say mixed. Right now, you can read hundreds of hot takes and reactions on the internet from people who are reasonably frustrated with the many departures from the source material that were taken by the film. You don't need me to complain about how Light was turned from a preppy, overachieving wonder kid to a wimpy school shooter stereotype. Everyone else has done that already. The reasons behind Death Note's failure to catch on with audiences are deeper than just the fact that it's different from the anime. I think it's largely due to the movie not really knowing exactly what it wants to be. For instance, there are several scenes in this movie that just exude style, harsh neon colors with some 80s moody cinematic flair. The movie seems to hit the nail on the head stylistically for telling a story that reminds me of the 80s cult classic Heathers. Light and Mia have a toxic, angsty relationship, where the wires get crossed between their romance and their murderous impulses. It's a lot like the relationship between Winona Ryder and Christian Slater's characters in Heathers. There's something engrossing and fascinating about watching this couple lose sight of their place in society and become intoxicated by their power to control the world with gruesome murder. It's kind of a neat way to tell a story about a Death Note, and I think it works well in this film. In the end, it becomes a mind game between the two of them as opposed to the mind game we all expected to see between L and Light. But L is still in this movie, and their rivalry still deserved a far better escalation and payoff than the silly chase sequence they ended up getting. The story they chose to tell has a lot of flaws in its pacing, direction, and storytelling that ultimately undermine the experience. So let's start from the beginning and think about some of the important choices a would-be director must make when deciding to adapt Death Note for an American audience. The first question is tone, and the contrast between realism and absurdity. Death Note is a movie that initially tries to take place in a very realistic world. A lot of the goofier aspects of the show just couldn't make the transition well. That's why L addresses the world as a man in a mask rather than as a giant letter on a television screen with a voice disguiser. This movie seems to at first prefer gritty realism and washed out gray sequences that highlight the despair of high school existence and boring flat meetings of guys in suits. But at the same time, this movie features bright, neon-washed murder scenes and chase sequences set to pulsing 80s-inspired electronica. They wanted to have an ultra-stylized aesthetic, but they had to underutilize it so it wouldn't take away from the realism of the world. Because after all, if you ever stop believing that this is a real world, all of the stakes disappear. So ultimately, they just didn't make much of a choice. I think the movie should have either been entirely stylized and melodramatic, or entirely realistic and played straight. Either it's a corny, Heathers-inspired teen angst romance murder drama with bright lights and pulsing beats, or it's a hyper-realistic crime drama with flat lighting. You have to choose one. But the decision about what aesthetic is right for the movie is one that you have to make to suit the story you're telling. If you want a Heather-style teen angst romance murder drama, maybe you need neon colors and 80s pop. But that's the next question. Is that the story they should have been telling? Adam Wingard spoke a lot about how he felt the story needed to change dramatically to work for an American audience. Where it seems most people disagree is on the question of what's the core of Death Note. The premise is an obvious answer, with lots of people, perhaps Adam Wingard himself included, under the impression that if you tell a story about a Death Note, you've included the core of what makes Death Note cool. But a lot of people, myself included, see the core of Death Note as something else entirely, the mind game that takes place between Light and L. You could technically describe the plot of the show without mentioning the Death Note at all, and it would still sound pretty compelling. A justice-crazed vigilante murderer befriends the intellectually gifted detective who's investigating him. When they begin to cooperate on the investigation, the detective has to gain enough evidence to prosecute his suspect, but the suspect has to stay undetected while learning enough information to kill the detective. Yeah, I know it's wordy, but you get the idea. It's an incredible premise, and it's a story that is well told within the framework of the Death Note as a storytelling mechanic. For me, that's what made the Death Note anime so endlessly watchable. And that's why when, spoiler alert, L dies at the end of the first season, I lost most of my interest in the story going forward. The Netflix movie skips over all of that, and immediately puts Light and L on a direct path of confrontation, without any mind games or trickery involved. So let's say if we were to try and fix the 2017 adaptation of Death Note, we start there. Make it about the mind game between Light and L, and bring with it the more realistic and down-to-earth aesthetic that I described earlier. The next choice we need to make is about Light as a character and his arc in the story. I obviously agree that the choice to make Light into a sympathetic, bullied wimp is kind of a cynical one, but it is one that ultimately better served the story that Adam Wingard tried to tell. The Heathers romance angle just wouldn't have worked with a more faithful portrayal of Light, but since we're not doing that anymore, anymore, hypothetically, let's make Light into an American version of the character he was in the show. A studious, charming, respected individual. A seemingly perfect guy who believes in justice and sees the world as very black and white. He's not the kid who gets bullied, he's the kid who beats up the bullies and sometimes goes a little too far. And since it seems like movies these days can't feature high school without becoming some sort of commentary on high school, this characterization needs to serve a purpose. We could have Light seem perfect on the outside, but be internally crumbling under the pressure to be perfect. He's that guy who's really nice and seems like he has a lot of friends, but they're all just acquaintances who hang out with him for his status. We can introduce him early on in the film as needing to talk to someone about something important, but none of his supposed friends seem to care. First, we display his popularity, and then we display the effect of his popularity on him as an individual. I also think it's perfectly fine to have this justice obsession come from losing his mother to a murderer. It's a little played out, but it allows the limited runtime of a film to condense that motivation in a tidy way. His relationship to his father is also a crucial element that's nearly squandered by the film. Our first introduction to Light's father depicts him as a real jackass, and they get in a fight. One of the most important elements of screenwriting is the art of introducing a character. The first scene you ever see of a character will influence your perception of that character for the rest of your story. First impressions are everything. The film wants to have Light's dad protect him and defend him at any cost, even when Elle suspects Light of being Kira. For that to feel justified, we need to see him and his dad get along and love each other. They need to have a closer bond as a result of his mother's death. That will make his defense of Light more believable and also make the inevitable revelation of the truth all the more shocking. That revelation should be a hugely dramatic payoff, and in this film, it's pretty much just Dad sitting down and asking Light how he did it. So, too popular to have real friends, his father is the only person he can be close to. But I think his father needs to be a good-hearted man who is slightly incompetent. At the point in the film where Elle arrives and reveals Kira as being Seattle-based, Light's dad is placed in charge of the task force and immediately knows he's in over his head. We should have a scene of him venting to Light in the kitchen about how overwhelmed he is when Light uses his privileged information to help his dad arrive at some sort of conclusion, whether it's accurate or not. This should lead him to determine that Light may be of use to the task force. He manages to convince Elle to bring him on, unaware that Elle has already decided that Light is a primary suspect. From that point on, the game begins. The second act of the film is entirely about the inner workings of the task force, showing how Light and Elle manipulate each other, while pretending to be friends. But now the question is, where does it end? Does Light win in the end, and manage to kill Elle just as he does in the first season? Or does the film lead to an ending more inspired by the show's conclusion, which sees Light flying too close to the sun and making a crucial mistake that leads to his crazed demise? To understand the best way of ending the story, we have to understand the theme of the story. What's the story about? What conclusion about the world is the audience supposed to arrive at once they've finished watching the film? You have to look at the ideologies represented by our two forces. Light represents justice without remorse, a swift and complete punishment of anyone who would break the laws of man. He lives in pursuit of a safer world, but also one where he is the foremost authority over all life. We should relate to him because of his noble intentions, but Elle should portray the idea that power like that should not belong to anyone. The decision of who wins should be about answering the question, who is right? Unfortunately, this is one of those instances where business and studio decisions can get in the way. One thing Adam Wingard's film does pretty well is tell a contained story that allows for a sequel, but it doesn't come close to evoking those kinds of thematic questions. And if the powers that be have determined that a sequel is in the cards, it's pretty hard to get away with killing Light at the end of the movie. But if we have no such restraints and are allowed to tell the best possible story with no regards for studio motivations, Light should absolutely lose at the end. His arc should show his motivations changing from the altruistic idea of a safer world to simply a hunger for power. This shift should be signified by the first time he ever takes an innocent life in order to protect his anonymity. It's at this point that we as an audience have to stop sympathizing with Light. I think Adam Wingard was afraid of making Light unsympathetic. It seems that while he indulges his fantasies at first, he recognizes when it goes too far, and it's Mia's more unhinged influence that brings about the eventual conflict and climax of the film. However, even Wingard sacrifices the likability of Light's character in order to justify some pretty pointlessly over-the-top Final Destination death sequences. If Light is supposed to ultimately be seen as a fundamentally good person, he should probably just be letting these deaths default to heart attacks instead of trying to horrifically maim and torture his targets for kicks. I think for this more faithful story we'd like to tell instead, Light has to become unsympathetic. At a certain point, we have to start rooting for Elle instead. And in the end, Elle has to win. I'd love to see a cinematic interpretation of the final showdown between Light and Nier with Elle in Nier's place. One where Elle and his team including Light's father, close in on Light and drive him to the point of total madness before catching a tiny slip that reveals the truth. Light should be left to die, screaming and wailing in a pool of his own blood, and L should be left to live with the consequences and reverberations of this final choice. This isn't an action story or a horror film. There won't be any chase sequences, gruesome ladder-based decapitations, or collapsing Ferris wheels. It'll be a slow burn, 2-hour, character-motivated, supernatural crime drama with a grounded and realistic aesthetic. One that takes its time with exploring the intricacies of the plot while delving into the essence of the characters within. A film that takes the core of what made the original Death Note so satisfying and hits all those notes in a way that pleases both the fans and the newcomers. Is that a version of Death Note that you'd rather watch? I don't think Wingard's concept for the film is fundamentally flawed. I think there's a place for a Death Note story like the Heather's angle they attempted. The crucial mistake that led to the film's downfall was that they reimagined the core of the story while trying to hold on to more superficial details like character names and plot circumstances. The story we got in the film never really needed an L character, because in the end, it was all about Light and Mia. Perhaps if the characters were also reimagined from the ground up and never fashioned to simulate the anime's characters, it wouldn't have invited such harsh comparisons. It also would have been free to go all in on a stylized and colorful aesthetic. Ultimately, there are two potential versions of the film that both could have been better than the one we actually got, but the question of which one would be better is entirely up to you. I would have loved to see a proper adaptation of the very unique and compelling dynamic between Light and L in the anime, but hey, a modern Heather's remake with a Death Note? That's pretty cool too. See you next time on Story Forward.